Hey guys, a while ago I did a hands-on lecture for a group of physical therapy students via Zoom, and I recorded the entire thing so that you guys could check it out as well. Now what I've done is I've included the slides and a link down below in the description, so check that out and follow along with me as we cover everything to do with creating a resistance training program, starting with a needs analysis and going through exercise selection, variation, frequency, periodization, not in that order, but we cover the nuts and bolts of how to design a resistance training program based on scientific principles and based loosely on the CSCS guidelines. So check out this full-length lecture, pause at any time to take notes, and stay tuned to the end for some really excellent questions that the PT students asked. Hope you guys enjoy.
Can you guys see that? Okay. It looks good. Okay, thanks. I don't have my own Scott the video guy yet. And for those of you who get that reference, I know Jacob, you'll get it. So I got to make do on my own. Okay. All right. So we're going to go through essentially this is loosely based on NSCA guidelines, but then I'll have some anecdotes and some points where I differ. And at the end, what we can do is kind of tie it back into PTs specifically. Okay. But also stop me at any point if you have any questions, and happy to just discuss around these points. These are the steps to go through when creating a resistance training program, and these steps are generalizable to a lot of different what's the word I'm looking for, career options, right? To a lot of different practitioners, right? So these steps are generalizable to a lot of different practitioners. Whether you're a strength and conditioning coach, obviously they're going to apply to them most specifically, but obviously PT, OTs, sometimes athletic trainers, sometimes different domains are in charge of prescribing exercise, and it's also important to understand them so that when you're interfacing with a strength coach, you know where she or he is coming from as far as the program that they're putting together. Okay, so these are the steps that they would walk through more or less in order when creating a resistance training program. So the first one is a needs analysis, and a needs analysis, it's essentially a sports demands assessment, okay? It can include a bunch of different components, one of which is an individual athlete evaluation. That individual athlete evaluation takes into account potentially something like a functional movement screen, potentially strength and power assessment, or energy system analysis. And this is all dependent upon what type of athlete you're working with, what the scope you're working with them includes. Like, are you their actual strength coach, or are you their PT interfacing with the strength coach, right? You're probably not, if you're the latter, you're probably not going to do an energy system analysis for this athlete. But just know that these are some of the things that go into a needs analysis. Okay. So more components of a needs analysis, we can think of it in two different sections. The first section is a sport specific demands analysis. So let's say that you all are working with a soccer athlete. Okay. You're going to have to now break down the sport of soccer and think, what are the work to rest ratios in soccer? What are the typical movement patterns in soccer? Yeah, there's kicking and there's running, but what kind of running? There's change of direction. What kind of change of direction? Is it frontal plane movement? Is it sagittal with some S curves? Is it multi-directional with a wide variety of changes, which is closer to what it is, with some long linear sprints? Okay, what are the movement demands? What are the time characteristics of the game? Okay, I think I mentioned work to rest ratios. How long are they running for? How much of that is high speed running versus low speed running versus walking versus standing? And is that different for different positions? Okay, what is the athlete that you're working with? What position are they? If they're the goalie, it's going to be a lot different than if they're the midfielder. All right, so sport-specific demands are first. Now, the sport-specific demands are roughly the same for every athlete in that sport, obviously dependent on skill level as well. But then we drill down into the athlete. Maybe you could have two of the exact same positional athletes, but they might have wildly different needs. Okay, one might get the job done being shorter and more muscular, more compact. Okay, having high turnover with their smaller pendulum limbs, and another might be more lanky with a longer reach. All right, they might be taller, and so they're going to have, because of their different anthropometry, they're going to have some different needs in the weight room, and that may change what you prescribe them. Okay, maybe we're doing low handle hex bar deadlifts with the shorter athlete, maybe even deficit, and for that taller athlete, maybe you need to stick to the high handle on the hex bar deadlifts. Okay, so it's gonna change the specifics, but maybe not the overall philosophy of the training program, the overall thrust of the training program, right? We can use a lot of different tools to get from point A to point B, depending on the different athletes that are presented to us. Now, if we're drilling deeper into each of these, analyzing the sport-specific demands, okay, these are going to include first physiological aspects. I've already mentioned the types of movement and the work-to-rest ratios, but we need to consider the components of endurance. Is there an endurance component? And is there a strength component, a power, speed, agility, flexibility requirements? I would argue that every sport has requirements in all of these. It just depends on the ratio. Think about a 100-meter sprinter. We were just doing this in class the other day. We were assessing training sprinters, watching a video of them actually go through practice. And I asked them, we know that the energy system, the primary energy system, is a creatine phosphate system. But why might these sprinters need to pay some attention to their aerobic metabolism as well? Okay, in the answer is because during practice, they're not just doing one sprint. They're sprinting and recovering. And yeah, they take a long time between max effort sprints, but that aerobic system is what's driving the resynthesis of ATP and the replenishment of creatine phosphate. Okay, and the better they can do that, the better work capacity they're going to have in order to handle and adapt to those practices. Okay, so we want to be thinking about all of these regardless of the athlete who's in front of you. Next is biomechanical factors, and this is the common movements performed, as I mentioned previously, technical skills, and injury risks. So if you're dealing with someone like a powerlifter, a low-skilled sport, no offense, Jacob, a low-skilled sport versus, let's say, a gymnast. These are two different sports, individual sports, with, where you take an attempt and you're either successful or you're not. And one requires very low skill, squat, bench, deadlift, okay? And the other is very high skill, lots of dynamic moving components that you can mix and match together on different implements. So we need to assess those things as well. Next, psychological elements. So things like mental resilience, decision-making, and concentration needs. If you have, let's say, a competitive cyclist, that's going to be a different headspace than if you have a competitive arm wrestler, right? And so when we're designing resistance training programs, that's something to think about, because oftentimes, if you're the one designing the program, you're also the one who's coordinating their overall holistic training interventions. Not always, but often. Okay, you're looked to as the expert for how to enhance performance through training. And so you might be the one to call in a sports psychologist, or even to start investigating some of these sports psychology tactics. Okay, now athlete assessment. I touched on a lot of these, but how are we assessing the athletes? First, physical capacities. So strength, power, endurance, flexibility, body composition. We won't go through how to assess all of those, but know that you should be assessing those as far as they relate to the program you're making for the athlete. Next, what are their technical skills, sport-specific techniques and tactics, and then their personal injury history and risk factors. I mentioned short versus tall, okay, different movement pattern styles. Also, take a look at, have they had hamstring pulls before? Have they done their ACL and had it reconstructed? Do they have shoulder impingement issues? What is their history? And then finally, the athlete's goals. Obviously, you could have two identical athletes, but if they have different goals, you're going to have different programs for those athletes. It's not going to be a one-size-fits-all program. So what are their outcome goals? The focus of the actual result of competition. What are their performance goals as far as the marks that they want to hit? Let's say, for example, here, running a sub 5-minute mile could be a performance goal. And then a process goal. What are they going to do along the way to get to those goals? And having those three things established will help you both to be accountable to creating a training program that sees them along the path from point A to point B for that outcome goal and the performance goals. Oh, cool. Perfect. Because I can't see everybody's camera. So yeah, maybe just, if you guys drop them in the chat, and then Jacob, if you articulate them, that might be easiest. Or just unmute yourself and interrupt me. That's fine too. Okay, cool. I'll keep going. And also, I'm recognizing the time. I'm spending too much time on each slide. Typical professor. All right, so needs analysis is done. Okay, you have that. You have an understanding of the sport, of the athlete, and their goals. Now we need to actually start generating the training program. So what I want you to do is to think about an athlete archetype in your mind, some sort of a placeholder for a specific athlete that you would be making a training program for, so that as I'm talking, you can apply these principles to them. Okay, so training frequency. How do we establish training frequency? Well, first, we need to align frequency with training objectives and goals. Okay. Also, with individual factors such as recovery capacity, age, experience. If you're working with an octogenarian, and I've worked with some octogenarians in my time, they're amazing individuals, but let's just say that they don't have the highest ability for training frequency. I'm not going to be training them every single day. Okay. They need a few days to recover between training bouts. Now, obviously I could also, and I actually do this if I'm training with elderly folks. What I do typically is I adjust the volume and bring it down so that we can get more frequent training and therefore better skill development with more touches on those lifts, with a lower fatigue impact from that training session. So there's lots of ways you can sort of adjust these factors, but just know that these are the principles. Okay, with training frequency, we want a balance of volume and intensity. Okay, we want to balance the workload to allow for recovery. If we're doing very, very intense work in the weight room, then we need a long time to recover and not as much volume of it. Okay, you're not going to go in, well, most of you shouldn't go in, and have your athletes do 10 singles at 95% of their 1RM on a compound movement. That's just going to be too much, unless you have an advanced athlete who's in a peaking phase, or maybe like a super compensation phase right before a peaking phase. Okay, we need to balance the volume and intensity. If you have very low intensity work, maybe some more extensive work, maybe it's a GPP phase, general preparation phase, it's the off season or something, you can have lower intensity work with much greater volume. All right, and we'll talk about periodization here at the end. What's the exercise selection? So are you doing compound explosive movements? Are you doing high CNS fatigue movements? Are you doing movements that cause a lot of DOMS, delayed onset muscle soreness? Well, then you might have to adjust the frequency for that. Or are you doing movements that are pretty easy to recover from, right? So for instance, if I have an athlete and they're training deltoids, okay, they're training their shoulders for whatever reason, those are very small muscles and they're more slow twitch and they're faster to recover. And then there's not a lot of central fatigue that comes from that. So you could train shoulders maybe 3, 4, 5 times a week, depending on the athlete, without a ton of fatigue that's accumulating. Contrast that with an athlete who, maybe we're training some sort of a loaded hip hinge movement. Maybe it's RDLs, Romanian deadlifts. A lot of fatigue from that. Okay, and the hamstrings are more fast twitch, and there's a lot of muscle mass that we're stimulating, and there's a high CNS toll from that type of movement. So I'm not going to train those 5 days a week. All right, maybe 2 days at most. Sometimes 1 day, maybe 1.5. All right, so that's going to change it. And then we have to monitor progress. Okay, you can adjust frequency, obviously, based on performance and recovery status of the athlete. Some other factors that influence training frequency. We're going to have training goals. Okay, is their goal strength? Is it hypertrophy? Is it endurance? That might change how you prescribe frequency. For instance, with strength, oftentimes because it's moderate to low volume, you could maybe get away with a lower volume strength plan and then prescribe that lift more frequently. If you're doing hypertrophy, though, oftentimes those sessions need to be longer or there's more volume in the session. So we need more time. And if we think of the time course of adaptation to hypertrophy training and the muscles actually going through the DOM cycle and rebuilding themselves, it can take several days, right? 3 to 5 days, 5 being on the kind of extreme end. Adaptations to strength, especially if it's a lower volume strength session, well, a lot of that is neuromuscular. Okay, and so that can actually happen a little bit more quickly. Same thing with power exercises. A lot of that is neuromuscular, and especially if it's low volume again. And so you might be able to turn around and train it again more frequently. Also, athletes level, beginner, intermediate, advanced is going to change this. Beginners can get away. Well, it kind of goes both ways. They can get away with more frequent training because their training is less intense. It's not going to cause a lot of damage to the body or central nervous system fatigue. On the other hand, if it's the first couple times that they've trained, they're going to be sore for a long time. And so you can give them less frequent training. Plus, they will adapt to almost anything. And so you can give them less frequent training, take the more minimal dose effect if they're okay with that. And to contrast with that, if you have a very advanced athlete, and let's say they're, Jacob, you mentioned John Hack at the beginning. Let's say John is deadlifting 900 pounds. And recently, I think he hit like 925 or something, which is amazing to see. And he's looking absolutely just yacked out of his mind. Anyways, you take an individual who's deadlifting that much, and gosh, that's going to take them out of heavy deadlifting for quite a while, for a couple weeks at the very least. Okay, so sometimes those advanced individuals are capable of just such high intensity, such high absolute loads that they need to rest for much longer. Okay, so the principle sort of goes both ways on that. And then, of course, recovery is so important. Oftentimes people say, you're not overtrained, you're just under-recovered, meaning that your recovery modalities, your sleep, your diet, your low-stress lifestyle, your soft tissue work, seeing qualified PTs to get, worked on, is not sufficient to support the training. Okay, and so maybe it's not that you're overtraining, maybe you're just under-recovered. So if you have a client who is, they're not sleeping a lot, they have a high-stress job, they might not be able to train as frequently. Okay, optimal training frequency for your goals. These are just rough guidelines. Strength training 2 to 3 times a week. Same thing with hypertrophy. And then for endurance, 3 to 5 times a week, just because we're not hitting those super high absolute loads. Now, again, I said these are rough guidelines because it totally depends on how much volume you're prescribing for each of these sessions. So this can change. All right, these are just guidelines. We talked about beginner versus advanced athletes. This is more towards the CSCS guidelines of beginners training 2 to 3 times a week, advanced athletes training 4 to 6 times a week. Again, though, like I said, if we're thinking like muscle group or movement frequency, I'm not going to have an advanced powerlifter or a really strong rugby athlete or an American football offensive lineman squatting 4 times a week or 6 times a week, just because they're more advanced than that. They're going to do it less than the beginner. Okay. And my beginners, like for instance, my son has gotten into weight training with me, which is awesome and so cute. He's 10. So we wake up every day and we train, and that kid could squat. He could max out on his squat like every day and he'd be totally fine. Now, obviously we don't do that because, I'm teaching him life lessons and I'm teaching him resistance training technique and lessons at the same time. So we don't do that, but he could totally do that and be fine, right? He's young, he's a kid, he adapts really fast, and he's a total beginner. So it's a low absolute load. Oh, split routines versus full body workouts. This goes to what I was saying earlier about it depending on the nature of the workout. What movements are you training? So you can train people 7 days a week for the rest of their life as long as they have the right split and they're resting certain muscle groups and training the other muscle groups. Now, I don't know that that's necessarily a good idea, but depending on your split, you can get away with more training days, but you've split it into different parts. So let's just say a simple example, upper versus lower split. Well, now, even if I train Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday, Friday, but I'm doing upper, lower, I'm really only getting a frequency of 2 instead of 4 times a week. It's 4 training days, but 2 times per body segment, if that makes sense. Oh, and there's balloons on my camera. That was weird. It must have been something with my movements. The Zoom's getting too advanced for me. And so, a more complex split could, you could break it up even more. Okay. Next, we'll talk about training load and repetitions. So make sure that you still have that avatar in your head of the athlete that you would be training. We've done the needs analysis. We have their training frequency, which is oftentimes, I should say, it's oftentimes sort of set in stone. Like maybe they're in their collegiate team and they're in the weight room, Mondays, Wednesdays, Fridays, and that's all there is to it. And so then you program everything based around those 3 days a week of training or what have you. But now that we have those, training load and repetitions, and I do this before exercise selection and order, and you might see a different order of events for creating a program out there, but I do this because it's more conceptual and tied to periodization. And even though I'm going to talk about periodization last, periodization probably comes first, but I'm talking about it last, so you have all these things in your head when we talk about periodization. Okay, but this comes next because it depends on the phase and it depends on where the athlete's trying to go and their goals. Okay, and before I even get to exercises, I do this first. All right, so first we need to understand what is training load. When I say training load, this can be defined as the total amount of work performed or the total stress placed on an athlete during the training sessions. In the weight room is quantified using sets times reps times weight or just intensity. Sometimes you can do intensity instead of the weight, so sets times reps times intensity, or RPE, rating of perceived exertion, usually on a scale of 0 to 10. Okay, and that RPE scale is not a linear scale. It goes up to a 5 or 6 being like moderately hard, not being average. Okay, you'll see it used in different ways, but really in the literature, 5 or 6 is moderate to moderately hard, and then it goes in smaller increments from 7 to 10. Okay, so there's finer degradations at the more intense levels. So first, you're not going to necessarily go test everyone's 1RM, but you should determine at least a rough estimate, okay? Because it's essential for calculating and setting training intensities. A good practitioner can watch somebody warm up and pretty much tell how much they're going to be able to do. That said, if you're going to be working with this athlete for a long period of time, and if they're under your care, you're definitely going to need to do some sort of either estimate or actual 1RM attempt or maybe a 3RM or something like that. You can also use VBT to estimate it as well. Or RPE. Let's say they get good at using RPE. You can have them do a set of 5 or a set of 3 or a set of 1, and they'll give you the RPE, and you can plug that into a calculator to get the actual 1RM or the estimated 1RM. Now, I mentioned previously this relationship between volume and intensity. It's an inverse relationship. So as the volume of work increases, the intensity, or 1RM, typically decreases within a session, within a week, within a mesocycle. So if you're going to give someone a ton of volume for that day, they probably can't do very high intensities at that volume. If you're going to give them a ton of volume over that mesocycle, like lots of sets, they're not going to be able to do it at super, super high intensities. Okay. Conversely, if you're training at really, really high intensities, they're just not going to be able to sustain high enough volumes. So when you're prescribing load, it's always a balancing act. Okay. Now, repetition ranges are important, and I want to explain this to you guys. For those of you who are maybe, let's say, uninitiated in the weight room, oftentimes I find that students think of rep ranges as sort of this number that you just stop at. Like if I'm doing sets of 5 for that day versus sets of 10, the weight doesn't really change. I just stop at 5 instead of stopping at 10. They might adjust the load a little bit, but they typically will just arbitrarily stop at those numbers. But really what we mean when we're looking at a repetition range typically is that it's a repetition maximum. And so when you see these ranges where it says strength is trained from 1 to 6 reps, that doesn't mean with a load that you could do for more than that. It means a load that you could do for only that number of reps with a little bit of degree of variation in there. So let's say that the most I can do for 6 reps at the high end of that strength or the low end of that hypertrophy range is 100 pounds, okay? And I do 6 reps with 100 pounds. The 7th rep, I would fail if I tried it, okay? That's a 6, and if I train at that range, I'm getting a blend of strength and hypertrophy. If I train at that weight for a set of 5, I'm stopping arbitrarily 1 short. We call that 1 repetition in reserve. It's still going to be a pretty high RPE. It's going to be about a 9 RPE. Okay, so I'm still training with pretty good intensity in the range of strength. So I'm still getting a strength stimulus, and I'm probably actually now training a little bit better because now that I'm keeping 1 rep in the tank, my fatigue is not nearly as high as if I maxed it out and did the full 6 reps. So now I can maybe sustain even more volume in that strength zone and then get a better training stimulus. Let's say though that instead of training at my 6 RM, I drop it down to 80 pounds. And let's say that's my 10 RM. And I arbitrarily stop at 5 this time as well. Now, that's a much, much lower percent of my max. The RPE is going to be much lower, maybe a 5.5 RPE out of 10. The intensity is much lower. If I have 5 reps in reserve, I'm training pretty far away from failure, maybe even too far to get a lot of gains from that. Definitely too far away to get any strength gains. Okay, so even though I'm still training sets of 5, the intensity is too low to really stimulate strength adaptations. Now, of course, I could train as fast as possible and accelerate really fast, and now I'm doing more velocity-based training, and that will give me power gains. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense with these repetition ranges. Okay, so we talked about load, repetitions, onto volume. So components of volume, first is the repetitions, the number of reps per set, and then the number of sets, and then the amount of weight lifted. That's the overall load, as I've described it in that previous slide. We want to think about volume as a driver of a stimulus, as a driver of the magnitude of the stimulus. So if I did 1 set of 1 RM, that's going to give me a certain magnitude of adaptation to strength. If I did 10 sets, 10 times the volume, that's going to give me a lot more adaptation. But it is, what's that phrase where it's like, diminishing returns, the law of diminishing returns. Each consecutive set gives you more adaptation, but slightly less than the set previous. Okay, that's how we want to think about it. Both hypertrophy and strength gains are volume dependent, but hypertrophy gains, getting bigger muscles, that's more driven by volume. Okay, so we really want to focus on things like time under tension, the number of hard sets with some like 6 to 20 repetitions, etc. With strength, that's more of like a moderate volume training paradigm. With power, it's even less, because with power, if you train too much, you actually start maladapting and get less powerful. So it kind of goes down the slope: hypertrophy, strength, power, as far as volume goes. And that's, a very generalized statement: hypertrophy, strength, power. All right, and here are some of the guidelines. So for strength, we're thinking 3 to 6 sets per exercise per session. Hypertrophy, you could do more. And endurance, we're doing higher reps, maybe not necessarily a larger number of sets. Okay, and remember, these are just basic guidelines. So I'm not necessarily going to do 12 sets per exercise all the time with hypertrophy. That's maybe just the upper limit. Volume adjustments for athletes, typically beginners, don't need very much volume, and they'll get stronger off of a small dose. As you get more advanced, you need a larger and larger dose, typically. Okay, next, exercise selection. So this is typically the first thing that people think about when they think about building a resistance training program, instead of all the other things, but that's putting the cart before the horse. So once you have everything else in line, then you go to exercise selection. So this is choosing movements that effectively target specific muscle groups and performance goals, and they should align with all of that needs analysis that you did about the athlete and the sport and their goals. Okay, so different types of exercise. First, and you guys probably know this already, but we have compound movements, isolation movements, and then what we might call functional exercises. That term has really been bastardized lately, but maybe think of that as exercises that mimic real-life sport or sport-specific movements. Compound movements just means that they use more than one joint. Isolation means that it isolates a single joint, okay? And then again, functional exercises, they're a bit more complex typically, and they mimic some sort of real-life movement. When we're thinking about which exercises to select, we want to think about specificity, safety, and efficiency. First, do the exercises align with things like the biomechanical principles of the sport, the force characteristics, like the force and velocity characteristics of the sport with the needs of the athlete? Okay. Next, we want to look at safety. I mean, really, safety should be first, but let's be honest, we don't think of safety first. Consider, is this movement safe for the athlete? So if I'm working with like an injured youth athlete, I'm probably not going to give them snatches. If I'm working with an overhead athlete, I'm going to definitely ask them a lot about their shoulders before we do any type of, behind the neck push press. So we're thinking safety factors. Next, efficiency. How much setup does this exercise actually take to do? Do you need to pull out 10 different pieces of equipment? And how long does it take to actually get a training effect versus something that I could just walk over there and get set up right away? Progression and variation. So with our exercises, we want to progress from less complex to more complex over the over the lifespan, but really over the training span of the athlete that you have them. Let's say you have them for a year, which is generous these days. Most people don't stay with a coach for that long. Let's say you have them for a year though, and they're really green. How are you going to get them from not touching a barbell ever to doing, let's say, hang power cleans with enough load to generate a good stimulus? And how are you going to do that effectively while still giving them a good training stimulus along the way? Okay, so that's, as you progress them, you need to be thinking about layering effective exercises so that one potentiates the next. For instance, in that situation, I would probably get the athlete doing front squats from day one. I'd probably also get them doing some sort of mid-thigh pull, just the pull, on day one as well, so that eventually they're going to be really comfortable exploding from the mid-thigh position and catching it in the front rack position. Okay, so I'm thinking about how do I layer these exercises with the end goal in mind. And then we want to incorporate sport-specific movements, but obviously we want to balance that with general preparedness. Okay, so we know that to be sport specific, you don't have to like do the sport with weights on. Like like for a soccer athlete, you're not just going to strap a weighted vest and say go play soccer and that's your resistance training. You're not going to go kick a weighted soccer ball. But you do want to think about, okay, what muscles need to be powerful, what muscles need to be posturally strong, what muscles are frequently injured, and how can we create robust tissue tolerance in those structures. And that would be sport specific to soccer. Exercise order is next. So you've chosen your exercises. You've looked at compound movements. You've chosen some isolation movements. They're sport specific, a good blend of sport specific and general preparedness. Now, how do we actually order them in a training session? Well, there's a few general guidelines. First, we want to go compound before isolation. This is because compound movements are typically more valuable. They generate more strength, more coordination. They take more central nervous system coordination, and they also cause more fatigue. And so, and they typically have more risk associated with them. So you do them first so that you're fresh, and then you finish up with the isolation movements. We also want to think high intensity before low intensity. So if you have, let's say, power snatches from the knee, very high intensity exercise, high power outputs, and let's say you have, lateral raises. Well, you're going to do the lateral raises last because not only do the snatches need a really stable shoulder joint, but the intensity is so much higher. You want to be fresh while you're doing them to get the most out of that power movement. And then even if you're tired, you can bang out the lateral raises no matter what state you're in, okay? So high before low intensity. And then also influence on training effectiveness. We want to think about things that enhance muscle activation, strength gains, hypertrophic responses. So maybe if the goal is hypertrophy, maybe you actually do want to pre-exhaust a muscle in an isolation movement before going to a compound movement. Okay, that's an advanced hypertrophy technique. Maybe you want to do something like a back squat before doing a vertical jump if your goal is power training. That's an advanced power programming thing called post-activation potentiation, PAP. So depending on your goal, if your goal is strength and power, typically we begin with the heavy compound lifts. In hypertrophy, you typically also begin with heavy compound lifts followed by isolation, but you can sometimes reverse that, like I said, in pre-exhaustion. For endurance, it's not as important because you're not using quite as heavy loads when training for muscular endurance. But I would say still definitely the intensity first, followed by low intensity would apply even in endurance. But if with endurance, strength endurance in the weight room, we're thinking things like circuit training where everything is blended together. So the order is not quite as important. Okay, rest periods. So rest periods absolutely will influence the adaptations, whether they're strength, power, hypertrophy, or endurance adaptations. Shorter rest leads to more metabolic stress, but potentially lower performance in the subsequent lifts. These are the guidelines in general for these different training goals for resting when you're in the weight room. For strength and power, we want up to 5 minutes, maybe even more, between our sets so that we get that full resynthesis of creatine phosphate. For hypertrophy, you can go as low as 30 seconds, but typically we want at least 90 seconds. And that's mostly for safety if we're doing heavy compound movements, as we should be. Unless you're in like a circuit training environment, or if you're doing isolation single joint movements, then resting less than 1.5 minutes is probably okay. And then for endurance, less than 30 seconds definitely increases the endurance effect, but it might lead to decreased performance in the next set. As I said, compound lifts require more rest, and the rest needs are going to vary based on the individuals. If you have a little tiny person that you're training, right, let's say a small female, in my experience, they're like, oh, I'm ready to go, set of 10 deadlifts, okay, I feel great, let's do that again. A really large individual typically requires more rest, not just, and don't think of it as just because they're out of shape. It's just because that individual has so much more body mass to move, whether it's by height or muscle mass, etc., and they're typically moving more muscle mass. And so metabolically, it's a lot more difficult for that individual, and so they may need more rest. Obviously, their fitness characteristics also come into play. If you're working with like a soccer athlete versus a shot putter, we're going to have some different metabolic profiles there. So the rest will vary for those individuals as well. Typically, I don't time rest periods. I let people auto-regulate them. So I just say, hey, when you're ready to go again, we're going to go. unless I'm trying to get some sort of a metabolic stimulus and I need to keep rests short, or if we're under a time crunch. All right, now, last section, I promise you, but we need to tie this all together with periodization. What is periodization? Periodization is a number of things, but really it's a concept that describes the training process as being cyclical, founded on building specific fitness characteristics in sequence in a non-linear way, such that you peak at the right time and avoid overtraining. Okay? It's a way of road mapping, not the specific route that you'll take, okay, but in general, seeing the end destination and knowing, hey, there's a few different ways I can get there, but I'm going to plan it out sequentially and logically so that I get there in the quickest or maybe the safest way possible. Okay, so when we're thinking about periodization, we're thinking about progressive overload, specificity, and variation, among other things. We're thinking, how are we injecting a new stimulus, rather a larger magnitude of stimulus with progressive overload? With specificity, we're thinking, what are the specific traits I need to train by the end, or need to have trained, and what do I need to develop sequentially in order to get there? Okay, like if I want to be a really powerful athlete, well, I know that power is force times velocity. Okay, so am I training force and velocity? And I know that if power is force times velocity, that's like moving a weight quickly, including my own body weight. So if I can make that weight a lighter percentage of my max, then that means I need to get stronger. And if I get stronger, it'll be a lighter percentage of my max. Okay, well, to get stronger, I know that the only tissue in the human body that produces force is muscle tissue. So to get stronger, one way to do that, one way to increase my capacity for strength is to make the muscle bigger. Okay, so now we're seeing how we can logically sequence these training adaptations such that they support the end goal of power. So first I make the muscle bigger. I teach the muscle how to be stronger. Okay, that bigger muscle is now stronger. And then with that new strength, I move lighter weights more quickly. And therefore, now I'm more powerful. Okay, now there's different types of periodization. You're going to hear all kinds of different names. Linear periodization typically means a gradual increase in intensity with a corresponding decrease in volume over time. Okay, you've probably seen that graph. I don't like the term because I've been influenced by, certain sports scientists who also don't like the term, but basically linearity is not a component of periodization. Periodization is cyclical and it is on purpose nonlinear. Okay, so it's kind of a contradiction in terms. Nonlinear or undulating periodization, same thing. This is a term that sometimes gets, a little bit misused. I would rather say undulating programming, typically, because all periodization should be undulating to some extent, but over a longer time horizon. Okay, but typically this refers to frequent changes in intensity and volume to stimulate adaptation while managing fatigue. Typically, when you hear undulating periodization, that means within a microcycle or within a week, you're changing, like you're doing 5s one day, 3s the next day, 10s the next day. Okay, I would rather call that undulating programming, but it's important for you to know that you'll hear both terms. And then block periodization is another form of periodization, and this is dividing training into blocks with a specific focus, such as hypertrophy, strength, and power, and only training for that characteristic during that block. Now, again, most periodization is in some way all three of these. In general, we want to have higher volumes to lower volumes, lower intensity to higher intensity, lower skill to higher skill, okay? So that we can peak at a certain time, whether that's on a certain day or for a competitive season. In general, we're going to have some undulation in the amount of volume and intensity. We're going to have deload weeks, okay? We're not going to always train the exact same way. We need a little bit of variation. And in some way, all periodization is going to have specific periods of emphasis and de-emphasis, where you emphasize one training quality and de-emphasize, but still maintain the other training qualities. Okay, typically we divide the phases into roughly the preparatory phase, the competitive phase, and then the transition phase, which is where we recover. Okay, you could also think of this as the general preparation phase, the specific preparation phase, where you go from general training to more sports specific, and then into the competitive phase. Okay. Some people also call this accumulation, where you're accumulating volume, transmutation, where you take all that training you've done and you turn it into something sports specific, transmute it, and then realization, where you realize the gains of the training process. And why do we periodize? Well, it enhances the performance by systematically targeting different fitness components, as I've said, and it reduces the risk of overtraining because now we're managing all of the training variables in a scientific, evidence-based, and logical way. Okay, instead of just sort of willy-nilly doing what we want, or instead of rigidly following a training program, no matter how the athlete is feeling. As we implement periodization, we want to start with long-term goals. So we're looking towards the end of the year. This is why you have to start with the end in mind in order to produce the rest of the training process. And you need to adjust it based on athlete feedback. So some people mistakenly think that periodization is like everything is prescribed to the T and you don't deviate from it, when in fact it's a dynamic plan that if you have a good athlete monitoring program, which is another overly long lecture in and of itself, and you're monitoring the athletes sufficiently, and for a lot of people, that's just checking in with the athletes. Hey, how did you feel this week? How did you feel after training? If you're monitoring the athletes effectively, then you're making small adjustments. It's like on the roadmap, if you hit a roadblock, you're not just going to plow through it. You're going to take the alternate route to get to where you need to go. You might just be taking a circuitous route. Yeah, so that is the end, you guys. That's the end of the slides that I put together for you. Maybe a few too many slides, but thank you for patiently sitting through my monologues. And I know we're over time, but if I do have a couple minutes, if we want to do some questions, and then Jacob, I'm more than happy to do a follow-up, via email if you guys have specific questions, or if you want to type out more detailed questions and send them to me, totally good with that as well. Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's a question that tells me you've worked with people before, because it's not something you think about typically if you haven't worked with people before or coached them. And it's one of the first things that you'll observe, especially if you've weight trained before and you know what it is like to go to failure and how far you are from failure, proximity to failure. And so I do two things. The first thing is I have them do an actual max. Okay. And doing an actual max sort of sets the ceiling for them. I don't do that on the first go. Okay. Typically it's a few sessions in, and then I let them know beforehand, hey, next time we're going to actually test how much you can do at this. It's going to be totally safe. I'll be there. I'll be spotting you. I usually teach them how to fail the lift first, so they feel very comfortable. And of course I make sure that there's no potential injury history that could be a risk factor. The other thing that I do is I watch their bar speed. And so typically when I'm coaching people, for most lifts, I want them to do the concentric portion of the lift as fast as possible, because there's a lot of research showing that you get much better, faster strength gains if you do a max effort concentric portion of the lift. And so by visually assessing the bar speed, I can typically tell how close they are to failure. And a lot of times the untrained folks or folks who never press close to that, they think as soon as the bar slows down at all, that the next rep they're going to fail. So I talk them through that. And I usually just tell them, give me another. And then they start surprising themselves and realizing oh, that's what it feels like to grind out a rep. And I'm usually in there close, and I'll tell them, grind it out. And I don't do that all the time, and nor should they do that on every set. But if I need them to experience it, that's what I do. Yeah, really good question, Jacob. Good question. It depends on if their plateau is in the strength or muscle size, or a plateau in a specific lift. And it depends on what they've been doing. So it depends. It depends on what they've been doing leading up to that. But let's say I assessed all of that and we knew, and let's say it was a plateau in strength. In that case, I would probably first make a small switch to the loading schemes. Okay, let's say they're training for strength. They're doing sets of 3 to 5. They hit a plateau and they feel like, it's been a few weeks and I'm not making any more gains. Two options. One option, introduce a novel stimulus. Option number 2, go back up the periodization ladder and sort of rebuild and then hit it again. And I guess that would also be introducing a novel stimulus, if that makes sense. So in the first case, you could do something like eccentric accentuated training. You could do something like velocity-based training. You could do something like rest pause training. You could do something like myo reps. So like introducing a novel training stimulus with the same movement in the same, strength parameters. Okay. You could also introduce that novelty by just going back to sets of 10 or 12 and then building back up into that strength stimulus. Does that make sense? So sort of repeating the process. Yeah, really good question. You've been following Coach Wolf, right? Yeah, nice. Yeah, so to be honest, I don't have a lot of experience with lengthened partials and when to inject them into training. But if we go based off of scientific principles and we think about the fact that in its lengthened state, the muscle is going to experience a lot of mechanical tension. And so if we're loading that lengthened partial range of motion with a lot of time under tension, there's going to be a lot of DOMs that are created and generated. So if your athlete is far from competition, I say totally fine. That's great. And in fact, it might be a good thing to do because now we're actually potentially improving their range of motion as well. If they're close to competition, then I would say don't do the lengthened partials. Let's focus on things that cause less fatigue, more output instead. Yeah. And Jacob, that's a super good point. And I'm glad you said that. When we think about deloading, we are resensitizing the athlete to the training stimulus. So in that process of resensitization, not only are we dropping fatigue, but now the adaptive resistance, or to put it conversely, the resistance to adaptation that they've built up during the training process, it's actually now going to dissipate as well with fatigue. And they might find that after they return from a nice week of deloading, that they can train hard again and they can train with renewed vigor and they can hit the same mark and then bust through it to break the plateau. Yeah, really good question. So, gosh, warm-ups can be so many things or they can be a lot of nothing. How's that for a not very helpful answer? So I think of warm-ups as a time to sneak in some things that I think the athletes need that also prepares them for their session. And it depends on the athlete, and it depends on the needs, and it depends on the session. In my class, what I tell them is obviously you want to follow the guidelines of, that the NSCAA puts out, RAMP, the RAMP protocol, raise, activate, and mobilize, and then potentiate, which is essentially a way of saying you raise the physiological metabolic processes, heart rate, blood pressure, sweating rate, body temperature. Did I say that one? That's R. And then activate and mobilize. You activate muscles and you mobilize joints. Okay. And you could do that with dynamic stretching sequences or skipping drills or targeted activations or mini bands, or really like the sky's the limit. And it depends on your athletes and what you're preparing them for. And then potentiate means that you do something that bridges the gap between warm up and workout so that they're ready to hit the workout with sufficient intensity. Typically for me, that's some sort of a plyo or a med ball throw or a short sprint, something that really gets, to use a colloquial term, the nervous system firing, right? It just raises their level of overall activation and motivation for the task at hand. So I would say warm-ups can do all of that. And at the same time, sometimes I don't even warm the athletes up. We just go in and we start with the bar for a set of 10 and then they go into it. It depends on a lot of things. It depends on, what are their needs and what type of session are we doing? What's the importance of it? How much time do we have for that session? Sometimes I'm like, okay, I could do a 15-minute warm-up with all of this great prehab stuff, but man, this athlete's under a lot of time stress and they're in the middle of finals, and really, I just need them to get a 15-minute hard stimulus and then shut it down for the day. And so, we might do like a 3-minute, 4-minute warm-up and then get a 12-minute stimulus and then be done. Or we might have 2 hours. And so it's like, okay, there's so much that I could do. Let's take a full 15-minute warm-up and we're going to do all these different things. And I'm going to be teaching them new movement patterns and, prescribing new prehab work for them to do later, but I'm teaching them now in the warm-up and all that kind of stuff. So it varies, but hopefully some of those examples were helpful. A warm-up can be as much as you want or need it to be, or as little as doing a set of 10 with the bar for your first movement and then adding weight from there. Yeah, you're welcome. Yeah, definitely. And I'll say, this will be the last thing I say before I have to go. I've had the pleasure of working with more and more PTs who are really integrated into the training process and into the high performance model, and see them really leveraging a lot of this like really good training knowledge and really good sports science knowledge, and then also bringing it back to the clinical setting as well. Because it's that trickle down approach. What we do for the high performing athletes obviously takes a lot more person power, a lot more money, a lot more expertise. But as that becomes more and more ubiquitous, it trickles down to everyone, and then we can all benefit from it. And so if you have the chance or the opportunity as a practitioner ever to work for a period of time in a high performance environment, and then you can take some of what you learned there and the passion there and the individualization and the pursuit of excellence, and then incorporate that into your personal practice with the general population where it's arguably much more needed, right? Where it may not be as incentivized with the dollar, but you better believe it's going to change a lot more lives when you are putting that to practice with, let's say a 40-hour a week blue collar guy who can get his job back because of the return to play protocol that you learned working with the basketball team. And now he can get back on the assembly line, right? Or, helping that soccer mom who had low back pain to get strong again. So now she can go to all her kids' soccer games and, pick up her little niece and all that kind of stuff to like live life more to the full. I think it's such a cool opportunity that you all are choosing to do. So I commend you for that. And I challenge you to look to these adjacent fields, find what you can, and then apply it to what you're passionate about.
Thanks for tuning into that lecture. If you made it to the end, well, congratulations. That was like a long time of me just talking at you. I hope you found something valuable in there. If you want more sports science content like this, then don't forget to subscribe to the channel. It really does help out. Like the video if this was valuable to you. And if you want more resources, don't forget to check out my Patreon and some of the other links in the description. All right, you guys, thanks for hanging out on this video, and I'll see you on the next one.